I frequently discuss the need to assimilate God's truth, His principles, His promises. That the process of taking ownership literally makes it part of our identity. It moves it from a concept to an empowerment. And to facilitate that, to propel your life, we are launching our weekly reference guides. Now, before I get into them, though, there are three compelling reasons why it's so valuable for us to invest ourselves in the process. And the first is pretty obvious. You and I. It starts with us. Sadly, the vast majority of God's people live below their potential. And it isn't necessarily through lack of effort, but it comes from that not truly understanding how God sees us, how He desires to empower us, and that He has a calling so much greater than we could even ask for, that God has so much more available to us, as incredible as it sounds. And at conferences, I frequently discuss a concept I call think, speak, act. That when we recognize that truth, that empowerment, that first we have to adjust our thinking. That until we align our thinking with that truth, that we may need to overcome insecurities, fears, even some of our own opinions and prejudices, that we have to align our thinking with God's truth. That until we do so, until we accept it as truth, we can't truly become that, live it out. But then the next step is speak. Speak is meditating on that truth. Now, psychologists would call it, they would say it's moving it from the conscious to the subconscious. And they would even argue that the point of that is the subconscious is what actually does all the work in your life. But we would recognize it a bit different. We recognize it as moving it from the soul man, our mind, will, and emotions, to our spirit, connecting those. Moving from our head to our heart. And in doing so, we're renewing our mind, that we're renovating our mind to align with God's truth. Remember, when you say yes to Jesus, your spirit is in complete agreement with God. But our soul man is where things get a little tricky. John said it this way, I desire that you would prosper and be in health as your soul prospers. Now, it's easy to fall into the assumption that that soul is some degree of righteousness. But in reality, what it's saying is that word soul is psyche. Literally, it's your thinking. I desire for you to prosper and be in health. I desire for you to live this amazing life as your thinking prospers. And so meditating, once we've accepted as truth, is the process of retraining our soul man to come into alignment, to come into agreement with God's truth. And speak is part of the recognition that meditation is more than just contemplating God's truth. That literally the word meditate means to speak or to mutter. That we would speak God's truth. That we would personalize it. And we would do this repetitiously until it literally truly brings us into alignment with that truth. Which is why these are weekly guides, that we can put an emphasis for a week on a truth and begin to make it, to begin the process of not just assimilating it, but of transformation. And then finally, act. And it's a recognition that we have to respond to God's truth. Many of His promises and principles are conditional, but many just require us to begin to ask the Holy Spirit, how do I live this out so that it becomes a greater reality? How do I live this out so that I see the benefit and it becomes a blessing to others? That we recognize first step is we have to assimilate it. We think, speak, and act until it becomes a part of us. But the second, and the last two are even more compelling in some ways. The second reason that this is so valuable is that our circle, whether it's your family, a team you lead, or even just those you mentor, that studies have found that auditory learning, just speaking, just teaching, is somewhat effective. But many studies suggest that auditory learning is actually one of the weakest styles as opposed to visual or kinesthetic. In other words, working it out, walking it out. The first impact becomes those in our circle as they see God's power at work. That it's not what we say, it's what they see demonstrated in our life. In fact, we're making the guides a downloadable PDF so that if you desire to share it with those you're mentoring, your family, a team, so that you are on a similar journey, please do. But it's a recognition that so much of what God puts into us is for our benefit, but more importantly, it's meant to impact and bless those around us. Which leads to the third and most challenging category, and that is the outside world. We're told to go and make disciples, and so often we make that a one-dimensional response, that it's sharing verbally God's truth. But we also live in a world that is increasingly ruled by deception and illusion. Social media and so on, people are sold on a regular basis compelling counterfeits. And so the most powerful way for God's truth to pierce that veil is not just what we say, but it's that demonstrated reality. It's the recognition that God desires to make you and I, each one, a living, breathing demonstration of His goodness, His gracious, His favor, His love, His truth, His empowerment. That becomes undeniable. What we see is when the disciples went out, yes, they shared God's truth, but it was so often accompanied by God's power. And so much so that the religious leaders couldn't debate the message. All they debated was how to stifle that message. It's a recognition that one of the most powerful ways that you can make, that God desires for you to have an eternal impact, that it is literally that demonstration, not what we say, but it's that deniable supernatural aspect of God working through our life. And so we are making the reference guides available weekly. They will be on the God-Powered app. It is free. It's available on all platforms. You can take all the God-Powered content with you, both the public free content and accessing the members' private content. And as I said, we're making these available as a downloadable PDF so you can share with those that you desire to have on a similar track to you. Look for them weekly, but don't just glance at them. Invest in the process of making it your own, of that reflection, that identification, that allow it to become part of the process of transforming our thoughts and then our identities, our empowerment into that powerful man and woman of God that you're called to be.